With Hashem's loving grace, welcome to Amunah Beams with your host Laser Brody. Today's podcast is entitled Mud and Potatoes, and it's a special message for the month of Elul. People misunderstand our obligation during the month of Elul and think that we're expected to make grandiose overhauls on ourselves before Rosh Hashanah. That's not effective, especially since the grandiose overhauls usually end up in sinking back into our old ways. The Gemara itself in Tractate Rosh Hashanah says that if we try to accomplish too much, we end up accomplishing nothing. All Hashem expects is that we're a little bit better today than we were yesterday, and that we strive to steadily improve beginning now and continuing through the coming year. Hashem wants us constantly to fine-tune and to make those small but very meaningful improvements in ourselves. The key phrase, not only for Elul, but for all of life, and for the service of Hashem is slow but steady progress. That's our overall game plan for this month and for lifelong. A great place to start that fine-tuning and slow but steady progress is by saying Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, with better intent. The rewards are phenomenal, and we'll soon hear a story I heard from one of Israel's foremost mashpim, which is spiritual guides, Rabbi Elimelech Biderman Shlita, and he heard the story from its protagonist, a Holocaust survivor from Yerushalayim. Before the war broke out in World War II, the elderly survivor was a yeshiva student in his early teens. The famed Maram Shapira, Rabbi Meir of Shapira of saintly and blessed memory, was the head of Lublin Yeshiva and the founder of the Daf Yomi, and used to visit other yeshivas. Well, he visited this young man's yeshiva to test the students. Well, usually, a visiting Rosh Yeshiva would grant small gifts to the boys he tested, but Rabbi Meir didn't bring any gifts with him this time. Instead, he told the students that he would give them a priceless morsel of advice that would enable them to live long and happy lives no matter what happened around them. He told them to be very careful in saying Birkat HaMazon, the grace after meals, with sincere intent. Our sages promise that this protects a person against the worst negative spiritual forces. Well, the yeshiva boy decided from that day on he would do that with dedication. He'd say Birkat HaMazon carefully, word by word, and with great intent. Well, not long afterward, the Nazis invaded Poland. The Jews were herded into cattle cars and transported to concentration camp. The first stage was the infamous selection. The women, children, weak and elderly were sent to the left, the gas chambers, and the able-bodied were sent to the right, to slave labor, a temporary stay of execution. Well, our yeshiva boy was now a lad of 16, but he stood on his tiptoes to make himself look taller and older. He didn't know what to do or to say when the SS officer would ask him what he was capable of doing, for he never did a day of manual work in his life. He was always in yeshiva. So he prayed silently, and he says, Hashem, please save me. For the last 3 years, I've been extremely careful about saying Birkat HaMazon, and our sages promised that I would never lack food and protection. Well, just then, as if on cue from Hashem, the man behind him in line whispered in his ear, tell them that you're a cook, and I'll tell them that I'm your helper. Maybe we'll be able to work together. That's exactly what happened. They were both sent to work in the camp kitchen. They had no problem in sustaining themselves. Well, one day, a especially sadistic Nazi officer entered the kitchen, and it irked him that a Jew shouldn't be emaciated and hungry. So he approached the young Jewish cook and put a hammer in his hand, and he says, Jew, you go behind the kitchen and you're going to dig a 6 feet wide by 6 feet wide long ditch in 3 hours. And if not, you're going to go to hard labor with all the other Jews. So even with a proper pickaxe and a shovel, the young man wouldn't be able to stitch such a ditch, even all the more so with a tiny little hammer. Well, again, he prayed to Hashem. He says, Hashem, our sages promised. I've kept my side of the deal. Please do yours. A truck full of German soldiers drove by just then. Seeing the young Jew with a sad look on his face, they decided they're going to have some fun. Well, they grabbed a sack of fresh-picked potatoes that hadn't been separated from the mud clods, and they started throwing them at the young Jew, pelting him with mud and potatoes. Well, they drove away laughing, and the young Jewish cook, he was bruised all over from head to toe. But now he had a pile of mud clods and fresh potatoes that he gathered by his side. Well, a few more minutes transpired, and a forced labor gang of Russian prisoners of war with shovels and pickaxes, they walked by. Well, these POWs were constantly hungry, and they gazed wide-eyed at the pile of fresh potatoes. And he said, "Please give us some." Well, the young man said, "No problem. If you dig me a 2-by-2 meter ditch, you can have them all." Within 15 minutes, that ditch was completed. Well, the sadistic Nazi officer returned to the scene, astonished. He couldn't believe his eyes. In less than the appropriated 3 hours, the ditch was dug. And the villain said, "You cursed Jew, I know that your God protects you, but I didn't know what to expect." Well, the young man was allowed to return to the kitchen. He survived the concentration camp and the war, and he went straight to Yerushalayim after the war. He never lacked an income, even during Israel's leanest years, and he married off his children with no debts. Now, with COVID-19 and the constant lurking threat to our health and income, this story and the promise of our sages becomes all the more significant. So this Elul, let's start performing the wonderful mitzvah of Birkat HaMazon, and let's accept the obligation to say grace after meals with the very best intent we can. We'd be doing ourselves a tremendous favor, and we're sure to be inscribed in the book of a long life for a wonderful new year and a great life with great health and adequate income always. Amen. God bless.